In the dim light of a dawn more than 5,000 years ago, when humanity was still groping its way through the prehistoric night, there was a piece of land between two rivers, where the first people raised their heads to challenge chaos, tamed nature, and created history. This land was called Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, Tigris and Euphrates. Not Egypt, not China, nor the Indus Valley. It was Mesopotamia that was the true cradle of human civilization. It was here that for the first time in history, humanity learned how to build cities, invent writing, establish governments, create laws, and worship deities through monumental works. But let's momentarily forget the concept of modern civilization. For Mesopotamia was not a paradise of peace. This land was where small city-states rose and were crushed in war. It was where kings from humble beginnings, from gardeners to orphans, rose to conquer the world around them. It was where massive empires reached towering heights like ziggurats, only to collapse in flames. The history of Mesopotamia is an epic, bloody, glorious, brutal, and brilliant. We will begin this journey from the earliest period, the age of the Sumerians, the people who turned barren land into cities, dust into writing, and stories into legends that live on for millennia. Sumer, where humans learn to be human. Imagine standing on a high platform, gazing down at the vast fields of southern Mesopotamia. This is Sumer, the land that the ancients considered the first sacred ground of civilization. There, amidst the scorching sun and sudden floods from the two rivers, a miracle happened. Humans learned to control nature. Around 3500 BCE, city-states like Eridu, Uruk, Ur, and Lagash sprang up on high mounds to avoid floods, surrounded by a complex network of canals and dikes. The Sumerian farmers mastered irrigation, grew barley, raised cattle and sheep, and stored food. This food stability freed people from the hunt and gather lifestyle, allowing them to think of greater things. The Sumerians invented writing. The first writing system of humanity was not a language for composing love poems. It was simple symbols, etched on clay tablets with a sharp reed. Initially, it was used for record keeping. 5 bundles of grain, 3 sheep, 2 jars of beer. But over hundreds of years, these pictures evolved into cuneiform, the first written language used by humans to record history, thoughts, and even the dream of immortality. The Sumerians invented laws, social classes, organized religion, and most importantly, they built cities. Uruk, the first city of humanity. Not just an ancient name, Uruk is where history emerged from the shadow of mythology. This city was once the cultural, political, and religious center of Sumer, and at one point, it was the most populous city in the ancient world. Here, scholars worked tirelessly, recording on clay tablets, and merchants traded goods from India to Anatolia. But what made Uruk legendary was not just its population, but its leader, Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the first literary work of humanity that has survived. It is not just the story of a great king, but an ancient hymn about life and death. Gilgamesh, 2/3 god, 1/3 human, was initially a tyrant. But after befriending the wild man Enkidu, he changed. Together, they fought monsters, argued with gods, and after Enkidu's death, Gilgamesh embarked on a quest for immortality. In the end, all he gained was a lesson. Humans are born to die, and the only immortality is memory. A story written over 4,000 years ago teaches us what many today still don't understand. Death is not the enemy, but what makes life precious. The first war in history. Sumer is also the birthplace of organized warfare, not just tribal skirmishes, but armies with commanders, chariots, and professional soldiers. The Stele of the Vultures, a stone monument commemorating the victory of King Eannatum of Lagash, might be the first document to describe war in modern terms. On it, you will see the Sumerian troops neatly lined up, spears aligned, advancing toward the enemy like a death machine. The king leads, the gods bless, and after victory, there is a sacrificial ceremony and the carving of the stele for eternal remembrance. Does this sound familiar? It's the military state theocracy model that most empires would follow afterward. But then, collapse. After over 1,000 years of development, the Sumerian city-states began to weaken because they were too similar. They shared the same religion, the same language, the same style, but they could never unify. Wars between Lagash and Umma, between Uruk and Ur, between kings who called themselves rulers of the four corners of the earth, drained the land of Sumer. While they fought among themselves, a man of humble origin from the north, Sargon of Akkad, was waiting for his chance. And so, the first empire in history was born. Next, Sargon the Great, from a reed basket to the king of the world. How did a man with no parents, no lineage, create the first empire of humanity? A strange tale, part epic, part fairy tale, awaits you to discover. There is an old legend. I am Sargon, the mighty king of Akkad. My mother was a priestess. I do not know who my father was. My mother hid me in a reed basket and let me float down the river. I was saved by a gardener who raised me as his own. Not Moses, not Romulus, nor any other mythical figure. These are the words of Sargon, the first king of the first empire in human history, in an era when power was passed down through bloodlines, where every city-state claimed divine origin. A homeless child, without lineage, without a heritage, rose to become emperor. This was deemed impossible, but the impossible happened. Sargon, from cupbearer to emperor, Sargon began his career not from the throne, but from the king's wine cellar in Kish. As the royal cupbearer, Sargon quietly observed every plot, every connection in the court. No one suspected that the man pouring the wine had the ambition to build a unified empire, something no one had managed since the time of ancient Sumer. When Kish weakened, Sargon staged a coup, seized power, and quickly swept south, defeating each city-state one by one. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Umma, Eridu, all bowed before Sargon's disciplined army. But he did not stop there. Sargon continued to expand his territory northward, through Akkad, crossing the Tigris, and reaching as far as Anatolia and the Mediterranean coast. For the first time in history, the entire Mesopotamian region, from the Persian Gulf to Syria, was placed under the authority of a single man. Akkad, the first empire of humanity, while the Sumerian city-states were merely city kingdoms, the Akkadian Empire was something unprecedented, a centralized government ruling millions of people from diverse ethnicities, languages, and beliefs. This was when the concept of the empire was born. Sargon not only conquered, but also governed. He established provinces, appointed governors, stationed soldiers to maintain order, levied taxes by region, and most importantly, he imposed the Akkadian language as the world's first administrative language. He also incorporated Akkadian religion into the Sumerian pantheon, merging Akkadian gods with Sumerian deities to create religious unity, something crucial to the ancient peoples. Sargon was also the first to pass the throne to his son on an imperial scale, paving the way for the hereditary monarchy system later followed by ancient dynasties. Behind the glory, there was blood and tears. However, every empire is built with sword and subjugation. Under Akkadian rule, many Sumerian city-states were culturally oppressed. The Akkadian script gradually replaced the original Sumerian cuneiform. Many Sumerian temples were destroyed and rebuilt in the Akkadian style. The former Sumerian kings, once called kings of the four corners of the earth, were now mere vassals. And of course, uprisings were inevitable. In the later years of Sargon's life, the provinces continuously rebelled. When he died, his son Rimush was killed in a palace coup. His younger brother, Manishtushu, was assassinated. It wasn't until the reign of his grandson, Naram-Sin, that Akkad regained its power. Naram-Sin, the king who called himself a living god. If Sargon was the conqueror, Naram-Sin was the one who deified himself. He proclaimed himself the god of Akkad, king of the four corners, and became the first person in history to have statues and images created of himself as a god, wearing a horned crown, a sacred symbol reserved for supreme gods. The engraving on his victory stele of Naram-Sin shows him towering over his soldiers, standing firmly among the bodies of his enemies, climbing a mountain beneath a sacred star. For Naram-Sin, the king was no longer chosen by the gods. He himself was a manifestation of the gods, a significant turning point in the ancient concept of power. But arrogance always has a price. Naram-Sin later came to be seen as a heretic, one who defied divine will, enraging the gods. In Mesopotamian mythology, it is said that after Naram-Sin desecrated the temple of Enlil, the god became so enraged that he sent the Gutians, a barbaric people from the Zagros mountains, to destroy Akkad, the death of an empire. The fall of the Akkadian Empire came quickly and brutally. The Gutians, illiterate, lawless, living by plundering, attacked the cities with devastating force. Irrigation canals were destroyed, farmlands turned barren. Writing disappeared from many places, temples collapsed, and trade ceased. The land of Mesopotamia entered the first dark age of its history. But the memory of Sargon and the Akkadian Empire was not forgotten. 1,500 years later, Assyrian and Babylonian kings still called themselves descendants of Sargon. The name Sargon became a symbol of the ideal conqueror, both legendary and dangerous. Next, the rise of Babylon. Who was the one who created the first law code of humanity? And why did the whole world bow before the king chosen by the gods as the guardian of justice? When Ur and Uruk became ruins, a new city would continue the epic of Mesopotamia, the return of the light, when the Gutians vanished into the mountain mists. A new era of revival began to take shape. The Sumerian city-states started rebuilding. Ur, the ancient homeland of the moon god Nana, once again raised its head with the mighty third dynasty of Ur, Ur the Three, but only for a brief moment. The Sumerian script was revived. Priests continued to record the epics, and the population returned to the ancient lands. But the sun that would soon shine over Mesopotamia was not Ur, it was Babylon. Babylon, from a small town to the ruler of the south. Initially, Babylon was just a modest town on the banks of the Euphrates, hidden behind ancient ruins. But it was this very ordinariness that allowed it to survive through the many conquests. Around 1894 BCE, an Amorite named Sumu-Abum took control of Babylon and founded a new dynasty. Under successive kings, the city was fortified, expanded, and became a trading hub between Akkad in the north and Sumer in the south. But it wasn't until King Hammurabi's reign that Babylon emerged as a mighty empire. not just dominating through force, but through reason. Hammurabi, the king who fought with more than just a sword. As the sixth king of the first Babylonian dynasty, Hammurabi did not ascend the throne during a time of peace. He had to face a series of rival city-states, Larsa, Eshnunna, Assur, and especially the kingdom of Elam to the east. Rather than going to war immediately, Hammurabi played a game of diplomacy, patiently forging alliances. He signed treaties, exchanged hostages, and established alliances. When the neighboring nations were locked in conflict, Hammurabi remained silent. And then, when all were exhausted, Babylon struck. In the final 10 years of his reign, Hammurabi defeated each opponent. Eshnunna was annexed. Elam was pushed back from Mesopotamia. Assyria submitted. Larsa, the strongest opponent of the south, fell. The entire region of Mesopotamia, from the Elamite borders to the Euphrates River, became Babylon's territory. But the real pinnacle was not the military victories. It was a stone. The stone stood over 2 meters high, engraved with hundreds of lines of cuneiform script. At the top, the sun god Shamash, the god of justice, sat on a throne, handing the scepter and the ring of laws to King Hammurabi, who knelt before him. That was the Code of Hammurabi, the first complete legal code in human history, carved in stone. When writing became justice, before Hammurabi, kings judged based on the words of priests, local customs, or personal whim. Hammurabi did something unprecedented. He wrote laws in formal public scripts and declared them the will of the gods. I, Hammurabi, the king chosen by Marduk, the bringer of justice to the land, the one who destroys evil and does not allow the strong to oppress the weak. The code contained more than 280 provisions, covering every aspect: property rights, marriage, inheritance, dikimus tadesiu, debt, trade, and criminal law. If a builder causes a house to collapse, he must be put to death. If a noble gouges out the eye of a commoner, he must pay in silver. If a son strikes his father, his hand will be cut off. The laws were harsh, but systematic. They distinguished between social classes, but there was a reason for it. And most importantly, everyone had to know the law, even the king. Religion and power unified. Hammurabi was not just a lawgiver. He was the guardian of order, the eye of Marduk, the sole voice between the people and the gods. Under his reign, the god Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, was raised to be the supreme god of all Mesopotamia, surpassing even Enlil of Sumer. In the new mythology, Marduk was the one who defeated Tiamat, the chaos dragon, using her body to create the sky and the earth. And who stood under the authority of Marduk? It was Hammurabi. This was not divine tyranny. It was a belief that social order was a sacred order. The law was not only to govern, but to preserve the balance between humanity and the cosmos. Babylon, the new heart of the ancient world, under Hammurabi. Babylon was no longer just a city. It was an idea. It represented an organized society where everything was defined by writing and law. It connected two cultures. Sumer had died, but it lived on through the records in Babylon. Akkad had fallen, but its language was still used by Babylonian scribes every day. Babylon was a rebirth. It was intellect. It was law. It was the new center of the world. But no law is strong enough to fight against time. When Hammurabi's descendants were lost in their palaces and priests were busy studying the stars, a storm silently rose from the north. Quietly, without warning, it brought with it war chariots and a leader who did not believe in Marduk. If you do not surrender, we will crush your city, burn your gates, tie your king to a stake, and use his bones as the foundation for my throne. Excerpt from a threat by an Assyrian king to his opponent. From the valley to the rock. Unlike the grandeur of Babylon or the ancient glory of Uruk, Assyria began as a series of small cities along the Tigris River in the northern part of Mesopotamia, a cold land with more stone than fertile soil, little rain, deep rivers, and violent floods. The Assyrians had no choice. To survive, they had to be harder than stone. For centuries, they were influenced by Akkad and Babylon, learning writing, religion, and even serving as vassals. But deep within the hearts of these mountain people lay a terrifying silence, not because they had nothing to say, but because they were forging swords. Asher, the name of the god, the city, and the dream of domination. Around the 14th century BCE, one of the first kings, Ashur-uballit I, initiated the first wave of resistance, expelling Babylon's influence, declaring independence, and claiming to be the representative of the god Ashur on earth. From here, Assyria entered a phase of acceleration. They established a professional army year-round, developed siege techniques using stone throwers and battering rams, became the first in Mesopotamia to use cavalry and heavy chariots. And most notably, they showed no mercy to anyone who resisted. War, the Assyrian art. The Assyrians did not write epics about heroes. They carved war epics on the walls of their palaces. On the massive reliefs at the palaces of Nineveh and Nimrud, you will see enemies having their eyes gouged out, heads chopped off and impaled, cities set ablaze, prisoners with cords through their lips, kneeling before statues of the god Ashur. But all of this was not meant to merely intimidate. It was to teach a lesson. Few words are needed, just a stone carving. The Assyrian propaganda motto. Tiglath-Pileser III, the one who restored Assyria in the 8th century BCE under King Tiglath-Pileser III, Assyria became the most effective war machine in the ancient world. He reorganized the army in a modern style, dividing it into special units, siege troops, cavalry, spearmen, and logistics. Using new metal, iron, tougher than bronze, sharper than stone. Implementing mass deportation policies to break local resistance. Whenever he conquered a region, he exiled the entire population, relocating them hundreds of miles away and replaced them with loyal Assyrians. It was a victory not just on the battlefield, but in memory. The pinnacle of cruelty, Sargon II and Sennacherib. King Sargon II continued the expansion of the empire, reaching as far as Egypt, defeating the Philistines, crushing Babylon again, and establishing a new capital at Dur-Sharrukin, the city named after him, the fortress of Sargon. He claimed to be the incarnation of the ancient Sargon, the founder of the Akkadian Empire, as if to prove, the old empire is dead, but his blood still flows in the sword of mine. After him, his son Sennacherib ascended the throne, not only as a warrior, but as the architect of fear. In 689 BCE, he completely destroyed Babylon, flattening its temples, toppling the statue of the god Marduk, and throwing the ashes into the Euphrates River. I made Babylon silent like a dead person. No more prayers, no more divine light. Nineveh, the cold heart of an empire of steel. The capital city of Nineveh under King Ashurbanipal was the clearest example of the contradiction within the Assyrian heart. In addition to being a military center, Nineveh was also a center of knowledge. Ashurbanipal, the last great king, collected thousands of clay tablets, building the largest library of the ancient world, housing the Epic of Gilgamesh, Sumerian myths, mathematical works, astronomical records, and medical knowledge, an empire that burned the world, while simultaneously documenting all of its knowledge. The decline, when fear no longer had the power to rule. But the power of fear also has its limits. When the provinces began to revolt more frequently, and when Babylon allied with the Medes from modern-day Iran, Assyria could no longer react in time. In 612 BCE, the Medes-Babylonian coalition attacked Nineveh. The city was besieged for months. And then, Nineveh, once the heart of an entire civilization, was set ablaze. Stone dust covered the libraries, smoke rose from the statues of gods, and the bodies of Assyrian soldiers lined the banks of the Tigris River. The soul of an empire lives on in the whispers. The Assyrians left no philosophy, no heroic epics. They did not pass down a code of laws to future generations. They left stone reliefs, meticulously carved images, so chilling. A surrendered foe, a person impaled, a burning city, as if they wanted to tell the world, we once existed, and we made the whole world tremble. But from the land that Assyria itself had leveled to the ground, an ancient soul began to rise again, not with swords or carvings on stone, but with gardens hanging in the air, with prophecies and mathematics. When the remnants of the army withdrew, a dream began to blossom once again. From Babylon, history can be burned, but memory cannot. When Nineveh fell into flames, not everything vanished. From the south, Babylon, the city once trampled by Assyria, had waited long enough to reclaim its voice. And this time, it was no longer just a city. It was a declaration. Neo-Babylon, an empire rising from the earth. At the end of the 7th century BCE, a Chaldean general, a Semitic people living in southern Mesopotamia, named Nabopolassar, rose up against the Assyrian occupation. In alliance with the Medes, he was the one who toppled Nineveh. After the victory, Nabopolassar did not march out into the world like his predecessors. Instead, he focused all his efforts on rebuilding Babylon. He knew only a symbol could sustain the empire, and Babylon was that symbol. Nebuchadnezzar's Akkad, the king of immortal works. His son, Nebuchadnezzar II, would bring Babylon to unprecedented heights. He reigned for nearly half a century, 605 to 562 BCE, and is remembered not just for his military victories, though he conquered Jerusalem and exiled the Jews, but for what he left behind, things that could never be burned. What Nebuchadnezzar left behind: the walls of Babylon, twice the height of the Assyrian walls, stretching for miles, painted dark blue and covered with golden glazed bricks. The Ishtar Gate, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, towering, covered with blue tiles, adorned with images of bulls and lions, welcoming the world into the city of the gods. The Etemenanki Ziggurat, the Great Ziggurat, thought to be the inspiration for the biblical Tower of Babel, so tall that it was believed its peak reached the stars. And finally, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the most romantic dream of the ancient world. The Hanging Gardens, romance amidst an empire of steel. No one is sure if the Hanging Gardens were real, but Greek historians, from Herodotus to Strabo, described it as a wonder amidst the desert, a multi-tiered garden with tall trees, artificial streams, and stone-paved walkways. It sat atop stone columns, watered by an elaborate underground pump system, making it seem as though the trees grew in the air. Legend has it that Nebuchadnezzar built it for his wife, the princess from Media, who longed for the forests and mountains of her homeland. To keep her from feeling lonely in the hot, sandy city of Babylon, he created an artificial hill covered with trees. If Assyria left a mark with blood, then Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar left, a symbol of love, poetry, and the ability of humans to build heaven with their own hands. Culture, astronomy, and a mind that reached the sky. Not only did Babylon build monumental structures, but it also became the intellectual capital of its time. Babylonian astronomers created star charts, lunar calendars, and predicted eclipses. They developed mathematics, laying the foundation for the sexagesimal system, 60-based, which is still in use today for time, hours, minutes, seconds. Priests meticulously recorded centuries of observations on clay tablets, creating the first astronomical database in human history. The Akkadian language now blended with the Aramaic script, forming a hybrid writing system between the classical and the common. And in the shadows of Babylon's nights, the Epic of Gilgamesh was recited once again. Stories from Sumer were copied and preserved, as though Babylon were the living memory of all of Mesopotamia. An unexpected end. The empire didn't die by war, but by Alexander the Great in 539 BCE, a figure from the east. Cyrus the Great of Persia entered Babylon without a fight. The people opened the gates to welcome him, not because Babylon was weak, but because the kings after Nebuchadnezzar were inept, superstitious, and cruel. The empire, once a bastion of scholarship and architecture, had fallen into disarray due to palace intrigues. Then, in 331 BCE, Alexander the Great arrived in Babylon. Alexander was captivated by the city. He stayed in Babylon, refusing to return to Macedonia. He planned to make it the capital of his empire, a place where East and West would unite. But before he could do anything, he suddenly died in the palace of Babylon at the age of 32. And it was here, in this city, that the dream of Babylon ended, not in smoke and fire, but in an unfinished dream. History always repeats itself, but never exactly. As Babylon turned to golden dust in memory, people turned their gaze northeast, where another empire was silently rising, not with libraries nor with hanging gardens, but with an unshakable belief that they were chosen to exist forever. Assyria had been forgotten. Babylon had been loved. But what about Persia? They would do what no one had ever done before, conquer with compassion. If Assyria ruled through fear and Babylon through symbols, then the Persians ruled through the belief that every people had a place under the sun. Cyrus the Great, a king who didn't need to conquer the people's hearts because they voluntarily gave them. In 539 BCE, Cyrus II, leader of the Achaemenid tribe from Persia, modern-day Iran, marched westward and defeated the Babylonian army in a single battle at Opis. But what was strange was what happened afterward. The gates of Babylon were opened without a drop of blood. The people of Babylon cheered for Cyrus. Why? Because before his arrival, Babylon had been ruled by kings after Nebuchadnezzar, who governed with violence, oppressed religions, and confiscated land. The people were exhausted. The priests were silent. And when Cyrus, known as the one who respects the gods of all nations, arrived, they saw him as someone sent by Marduk, the first empire of human rights. It wasn't just a legend. Cyrus truly enacted a special document, the Cyrus Cylinder, regarded as the first declaration of human rights in history. In it, he declared, not to destroy local temples, allowing every nation to worship its own deities. Returning the Jews from Babylon to Jerusalem to rebuild their temple, he didn't just conquer land, he conquered hearts. The administrative system, an empire of governance and belief. Cyrus and his successors, especially Darius I, built the largest empire of the ancient world, from India to Egypt, from the Caspian Sea to the Mediterranean. To manage Mesopotamia, they divided the empire into administrative provinces, satrapies, each with its own governor, but required to pay taxes to the central government. Built a royal road connecting Susa, Persia, to Sardis, modern-day Turkey, which took 7 days by horseback or 3 months on foot. Used local cuneiform script, not imposing Persian language on the Mesopotamians. Respected local beliefs. No destruction of Marduk's temple, no destruction of the Etemenanki ziggurat, and continued priestly activities. The Babylonians were no longer the center of the world, but they were not erased from the spiritual map. Zoroastrianism, a new belief in the ancient land. At the same time, a new faith from Iran began to spread southward. Zoroastrianism, the dualism of good and evil. Ahura Mazda, the god of light, truth, and order. Angra Mainyu, the god of darkness, deceit, and chaos. Humans stood in between, free to choose their path. This philosophy deeply influenced later religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In Babylon, Marduk's priests began to adopt Zoroastrian influences. Records started mentioning concepts like light, darkness, choice, destiny. Mesopotamia, once again, did not die. It transformed. The final encounter, Alexander the Great, and the last whisper of Babylon. In 331 BCE, after defeating Darius III at the Battle of Gaugamela, Alexander the Great entered Babylon, not as a conqueror, but as a pilgrim. Alexander did not destroy the city. Instead, he stayed there, planning to make Babylon the new capital of his empire, a place where East and West would unite. But fate did not allow it. Just a few years later, in 323 BCE, he died in the palace of Babylon at the age of 32. The cause of death remains unknown, illness, poisoning, or destiny. And it was here, in Babylon, that the dream of Mesopotamia ended, not in smoke and fire, but in an unfinished dream. A land without a capital, but still a cradle. After Alexander's death, his generals divided the empire. Babylon gradually fell into obscurity. Temples were no longer lit. Clay tablets slowly crumbled with time. The Euphrates River changed its course, leaving ghost cities by the sands. But from these ruins, humanity rediscovered itself. Cuneiform was deciphered in the 19th century, helping us understand Sumer and Akkad. The Code of Hammurabi became an inspiration for modern legal systems. Babylonian astronomy was used to trace solar eclipses from thousands of years ago. And the Epic of Gilgamesh was revived as a haunting echo of an ancient soul. But if empires have fallen, temples turn to dust, and rivers have changed course, what remains? Could history lie not in stone or pyramids, but in the very question, where do we come from, and what makes a civilization worthy of being remembered? The answer awaits you in the final chapter, the farewell of Mesopotamia. If Egypt is the land of pyramids, then Mesopotamia is the land of ideas. No grand wonders visible from space, no mummies in stone tombs, No solid gold buried beneath the sand. But here, between the mud of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, humanity first learned to record its voice, create laws, seek the meaning of existence, and gaze at the night sky to understand the laws of the universe. An intangible legacy, but immortal. Today, you are reading these words in an alphabet. But have you ever wondered, where did writing begin? Over 5,000 years ago, in the city of Uruk, a priest used a sharpened reed to carve symbols onto wet clay, creating the first writing system of humanity, cuneiform, initially used for record keeping, then to record thoughts, epics, legal texts, astronomical lessons, love poetry, even the story of the Great Flood, the immortal man, the sorrow of losing a close friend, all originated here. You live in a society with laws, taxes, cities with irrigation systems. These things didn't come from thin air. They were first experimented with in Mesopotamia. Without them, human history would be different if the Sumerians hadn't laid the foundation for writing, if the Akkadians hadn't created the concept of the empire, if the Babylonians hadn't written the code of Hammurabi and built towers that reached the clouds, if the Assyrians hadn't preserved the library of Nineveh, and if the Persian kings hadn't preserved local religions, the world would have lost half of its soul. From land to people to ideas, Mesopotamia was the first place where agriculture became the foundation of the economy. It was the first place where power was no longer random, but governed by laws, calculations, and organization. It was the first place where humanity saw itself in the question of immortality. And it was the first place where humans faced death not with resignation, but with the desire to leave a mark. O Gilgamesh, everything will pass, but your words will be written forever on clay tablets. The Epic of Gilgamesh. Why do we still tell this story? Because even though the empires have vanished, the core questions remain. What is a just society? Can writing change fate? Can humans touch immortality through actions or only through memory? Mesopotamia doesn't give us definitive answers, but they were the first to ask those questions. Mesopotamia, not just the past. It is where history begins. No one lives forever, no empire endures, no monument remains intact. But when you write, when you think about right and wrong, when you turn the pages of a book to trace the origins of everything, you are walking on the land of Mesopotamia.